Welcome to The Explainer. Today, I'll be your guide, stepping into the shoes of the Pale Inquisitor to walk you through a truly dark and mesmerizing narrative. We're looking at a tale that strips away absolutely everything we think keeps us safe. It's the tragic accounting of a Victorian sea captain's fall, a really devastating plunge from the absolute height of arrogant certainty straight into a realm of abyssal madness. We're going to trace his steps, look at the evidence he left behind, and uncover exactly how a man who was so incredibly sure of his place in the universe lost his way entirely.
But before we go any further, I want you to genuinely consider this for a moment. What happens when the impenetrable shields of human logic just shatter? We rely so much on reason, on our rules, on the tangible tools of engineering to protect us from the terrifying vulnerability of the unknown. But what if those tools aren't actually shields at all? What if our logic is precisely the thing that breaks us? That is the core philosophical terror we're going to be exploring today.
All right, Act 1, The Glass Fortress. Okay, let's dive into this. We start off with the captain in this initial state of just supreme hubris. He wasn't just a regular sailor. He was a man who possessed an absolute, unwavering trust in a mechanical universe, one he believed was strictly governed by divine order. He sailed within this so-called glass fortress of logic, deeply convinced that the universe was completely predictable. Think about the Victorian mindset of the time, right? It was an era of immense confidence in industry and reason. In his eyes, things like lighthouses and oil lamps weren't just helpful navigational aids, they were impenetrable shields. He truly believed human precision had essentially conquered the darkness. And that brings us to a really critical concept here, the zenith. Now, in literal terms, a zenith is simply a point in the sky used for celestial navigation. It's a way to guide a ship using the stars. But the story layers a second, much darker meaning onto this. The captain stood at what's called the zenith of rationality. This was literally the very peak of human arrogance. It was the absolute limit of logic. He lived at the highest point of a delusion, feeling entirely safe, totally secure, and comfortably well lit. Moving right along to Act 2, The Precipice of Logic. This right here is the pivotal turning point of the whole tale. You see, in astronomy, once an object reaches its zenith, it has absolutely nowhere to go but down. The zenith isn't a permanent resting place. It transforms from a celestial peak into the terrifying threshold of an inevitable, unpreventable fall. Notice the stark contrast we're looking at. On one side, we have his initial state, celestial navigation. He's looking up, trusting the stars and the morning light, feeling completely masterful. But as he steps off that precipice, his abyssal descent begins. His gaze drops from the heavens. He is no longer looking up to the sky for guidance. Instead, he's looking down into a bottomless memory, forced into a state of hollowed servitude. His entire orientation to the universe has violently inverted. So, the zenith is really just a threshold. It is the exact boundary where human engineering fails and logic collapses entirely into the unknown. When the ego reaches its absolute limit, rationality doesn't suddenly step in to solve the mysteries of the deep. Not at all. Instead, rationality shatters under the weight of the inexplicable. The captain's logic couldn't save him. It only brought him to the very edge of the cliff.
Which brings us to Act 3, Oak to Bone.
Now, here is where the philosophical concepts take on a gruesome physical manifestation. Let's walk through this timeline of his moral collapse. He starts off in the safety of the glass fortress, hits the absolute limit of his logic, plunges straight into the bottomless memory of the abyss, and finally arrives at hollowed servitude. The text ominously describes this entire process as a devastating purification through subtraction. Bit by bit, his certainties, his arrogance, and his very identity are stripped away until absolutely nothing but the core remains. And we see that purification through subtraction perfectly and tragically represented in his vessel. The physical transformation of the ship is incredibly stark. It goes from a proud merchant vessel made of polished, solid oak and shining brass, right down to the skeletal form of a ghost ship. And this physical change directly mirrors his internal moral decay. Just as his rigid Victorian certainty is hollowed out by the shadows he once arrogantly thought he mastered, the solid oak of his ship literally rots away to expose a skeletal, bone-like frame. The ship dies exactly as his morality collapses. We actually get to hear the captain's descending madness bleed through his own journal entries. He writes, "My soul is a messy draft, destined for purification through subtraction." It's a moment of terrifying self-awareness, isn't it? He realizes that his inner decay perfectly matches his rotting skeletal vessel. The
The proud merchant is just gone, entirely replaced by a hollow framework. Into Act 4, the Ledger of Regret. We are now entering the absolute darkest part of this epic narrative. The once proud merchant of certainty has completely lost his way. He doesn't just die or disappear, his identity fundamentally breaks. The text explicitly details a horrifying transformation. The merchant navigator becomes a vampire and a grim agent for the deep. He is no longer a human navigating the world. He is a ghost, functioning solely as an abyssal collector. His agency is just gone, replaced entirely by a dark, relentless compulsion to serve the shadows. So what exactly is this grim agent collecting? Well, if you open his ledger and look at the entries, it's chilling. He collects the chaotic noise of guilt, the agonizing loss of his Victorian certainty, and the very shadows he once mistakenly thought his oil lamps and lighthouses had mastered. I want you to just imagine the sheer, crushing weight of recording that accumulated chaos, page by page, entry by entry, in a ledger of regret.
His journal reflects this absolute, bottomless despair. He writes, "I am but a collector of the chaotic noise of guilt, a hollowed servant of the abyss." All of his former arrogance, all of his intense faith in mechanical clockwork and divine order, it's all been wholly replaced by endless echoing guilt. He is shackled to his past, forever bound to the depths.
And this brilliantly illustrates our final chapter, Act 5, the necrotic finality. Everything we've learned about the limits of logic and the decay of the soul culminates in one really chilling realization. Reason and lighthouses are not shields. They are markers of vulnerability. Think about a lighthouse for a second. Yes, obviously it warns ships of rocks, but it also violently pierces the darkness, drawing a massive amount of attention to itself. Basically says, here I am. The story posits that our human reliance on rationality works the exact same way. It doesn't actually protect our spirits, it identifies us to the abyss. It shines a massive spotlight on our profound vulnerability. So at the height of his logic, the captain was entirely exposed to what the text calls a necrotic finality. This is a state of being where human laws and logic provide absolutely no salvation whatsoever. When you are standing at the zenith of rationality, relying purely on the tools of your own making, you are actually at your most unprotected. You are utterly, completely exposed to the terrible vulnerability of the unknown.
Which leaves us with this final, pretty haunting thought. We all build our own glass fortresses. We all have our polished oak and our lighthouses of reason that we cling to. But when your own zenith of rationality inevitably reaches its limit and shatters, what will be written in your ledger of regret? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I hope it leaves you questioning your own certainties and definitely eager to explore the depths of these incredible philosophical themes even further.